The library had always been my escape, a place where I could tune out the noise of the world and lose myself in the pages of books. It was supposed to be where I came to focus, to study, to breathe. But today, something was different. As I sat at one of the study tables, surrounded by rows of silent books, my attention wasn't on any of them. My phone screen glowed brightly in front of me. The endless scroll of social media updates, news articles, and random thoughts pulling me deeper into its grip. The quiet hum of the library, the soft rustle of pages turning around me felt like distant background noise, something I couldn't connect to. I knew I should be reading, studying, doing something productive, but the pull of my phone was stronger than my will to focus. It wasn't that I didn't want to work. It wasn't that I didn't feel guilty for wasting time. But every time I tried to pull myself away from the screen, I found my fingers reaching for it again, almost as if it had a magnetic force. The notifications kept coming, messages, reminders, and updates that somehow made me feel both connected and isolated at the same time. I looked up briefly, noticing how everyone around me was absorbed in their own quiet worlds. Their heads bent over textbooks and notebooks. I envied them. They were able to stay in the moment, immersed in their work. But not me, not today. As the minutes ticked by, the feeling of guilt weighed heavier on my shoulders. The library was meant to be a space for focus, for quiet contemplation. And here I was, distracted, disconnected, and unable to break free from the digital web I had tangled myself in. I sighed, scrolling once more, hoping that this time I would find something worth my attention. But then, without warning, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I blinked, startled, and looked up. Standing there almost like a figure from another world was the librarian. She was holding a book in her hands, a book that seemed out of place in the sea of academic texts and journals surrounding us. Her eyes met mine with a knowing look, and she smiled gently. "I think this one might be just what you need," she said, her voice soft but steady. The moment I looked up and saw her standing there, it felt like the entire library paused. She wasn't someone I'd ever paid much attention to before, just another quiet figure who moved between shelves, returning books to their rightful places. But today, the librarian seemed different. There was a calm confidence in the way she held herself, a quiet presence that somehow silenced the noise in my head. She held a book in both hands, not a thick textbook or a study guide like the ones piled on my table, but a hard cover with a worn spine and a deep emerald green jacket that looked like it had a story of its own. "I think this one might be just what you need," she said, her voice warm and gentle, like she was offering more than just a book. I blinked a little, thrown off. "Sorry," I asked, glancing at the book, then back at her face. She smiled, kind, patient, like she already knew I was skeptical. "You've been sitting here a while, haven't you?" she added, glancing subtly at the phone in my hand. Sometimes when we can't concentrate on what we're supposed to be doing, it means we're meant to be somewhere else, at least for a little while. There was no judgment in her tone, just quiet understanding. I didn't know what to say. No one had spoken to me in the library in weeks, maybe months. I was used to blending in, to being left alone. But here she was, interrupting that silence and offering me a book I hadn't asked for. "What kind of book is it?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. "A mystery," she replied, her eyes twinkling slightly. "But maybe not in the way you're expecting." Before I could ask what she meant, she placed the book gently on the table in front of me, nodded once, and walked away, just like that. No explanation, no push, just a quiet invitation to take a detour from whatever rut I was stuck in. I stared at the book for a long moment. I wasn't even sure why I hadn't just pushed it aside or ignored the interaction altogether. But something about the exchange, Her timing, her words, that oddly familiar cover, kept me from going back to my phone. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and opened to the first page. The first page drew me in like a whisper. In a quiet room, I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe a typical whodunit or a thrilling murder mystery, but what I found was something different. The story didn't start with a crime. It started with a character who felt eerily familiar. A young person sitting alone in a crowded world, glued to their screen, numb to the beauty around them. I felt a strange jolt run through me. It was almost as if the book had been watching me before I opened it. The character in the story wasn't named, only referred to as you. It was written in second person, something I'd always found odd in other books, but here it felt strangely personal. You don't remember the last time you looked up, it said. You scroll through noise hoping for meaning, but you don't realize that meaning isn't buried in pixels. It's waiting in the quiet. I stopped reading and looked around, half expecting someone to be playing a trick on me, but the library was as calm as ever. I turned the page. As I kept reading, the story unfolded not like a typical narrative, but like a mirror. You wandered through a dreamlike world, half library, half forest, guided by strange signs and questions instead of directions. The pages were filled with riddles and reflections, odd encounters with characters who asked uncomfortable questions. What are you really looking for? Who told you that productivity equals worth? When did you last feel joy without needing to share it with the world? With every turn of the page, it felt less like I was reading and more like I was being read. Like the book knew the questions that had been lingering inside me for months. I'd been lost in deadlines, in performance and constant digital comparison. I'd forgotten what it felt like to feel connected to myself. But now, as I flipped each page, I started to remember. There was one part that made me stop completely. The character you find's an old book buried beneath leaves in this strange library forest. On the cover, a name. Your name. Inside a list of things you once dreamed of doing. Some of them silly, some forgotten, some heartbreakingly real. Learn to draw, write letters by hand, sit and watch the sky. I hadn't thought about those things in years. But here they were printed on the page as if someone had reached inside my mind and pulled out the pieces I'd buried under real life. I didn't know how long I had been reading. The sounds around me had faded. The weight on my shoulders, the pressure to always be doing something measurable, productive, had started to lift. If only just a little, I wasn't racing through the book. I was breathing through it, letting it guide me gently deeper into a space I hadn't visited in a long time, my own stillness. The book didn't offer a clean solution or a grand ending. It didn't promise happiness or success. What it gave me was something far more valuable. A pause, a gentle nudge to be still, to look up, to be curious about my own life again. It reminded me that stories reel. Stories don't always scream for attention. Sometimes they whisper, and sometimes those whispers are exactly what we need. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to the library, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, curiosity, longing. That mysterious book had awakened something I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet sense of wonder. It didn't have a barcode, no author was listed. Just a single title etched into its faded spine, The Mirror in the Stacks. I hadn't even checked it out. After I'd reluctantly closed it that first afternoon, I had returned it to the librarian, unsure of what to say. "Can I borrow it?" I'd asked awkwardly. She smiled almost knowingly. "You already are." Now, each time I returned, she gave me a subtle nod, as if she knew the book was still unfolding its magic in my mind, even away from its pages. But what unsettled me wasn't just the book's content. It was what started happening in my life. At first it was small. A conversation between characters in the book mirrored one I had with my roommate the next day, word for word. Then a quote from the story showed up in a random post I scrolled past online. Things I thought were fictional, like a man on a park bench feeding squirrels with sunflower seeds or a busker playing a haunting melody on a violin. Near the coffee shop started appearing in real life just as the pages described them. It was subtle at first, like déjà vu I couldn't shake. But the more I read, the more vivid these coincidences became. I remember one specific moment that truly shook me in the book. The character you finds a handwritten letter tucked inside a book in the library. The letter is short, heartfelt, signed only with the initials. That same evening, I pulled out a random book from a shelf, something I'd never noticed before, and a piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It was a letter, short, heartfelt, signed L.M. I stood, frozen chills running down my spine. This couldn't be happening. I glanced around, half expecting hidden cameras or some elaborate prank, but there was nothing, just the soft rustling of pages and the scent of old books. Was the book predicting my life, or was my life bending to the will of the book? It was a disorienting feeling, like standing between two mirrors and seeing infinite versions of yourself stretch into the distance. I began to question which came first, the story or the reality. Each page I read felt like a prophecy, or perhaps a reflection of a part of me I hadn't. The line between fiction and truth blurred so completely that I found myself narrating my own diary in my head, as if I were still inside the book's strange world. Even stranger were the themes it pressed into me. It wasn't just about coincidence. It was about noticing, about how much beauty we miss when we rush through our lives, how many clues the world gives us when we slow down. The book wasn't magical in the way I thought. There was no spell, no fantasy. The magic was that it made me see my life differently, not just the events, but the patterns, the emotions, the hidden meaning in mundane things, and the librarian. She never offered explanations. She simply watched gently, like a guide in a dream who only speaks when necessary. One day I asked her directly, "Where did this book come from?" She looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "Maybe the better question is, why did it find you?" I couldn't stop thinking about her question. Why did it find you? It echoed in my mind as I walked home that evening, and even louder as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the soft pulse of city lights bleeding through the window blinds. I'd been so caught up in the mystery of the book's strange reflections of my life that I hadn't stopped to ask what it all meant, what it was trying to show me. So I went back again. The library had become my refuge, not for studying or escaping the noise of the world, but because it had somehow become the only place where I could hear my own thoughts clearly. The librarian was there, as always, quietly shelving books. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't have to. She looked up and for the first time really looked at me, not as a stranger, not as a student or patron, but as someone searching. She gestured toward the back of the library, a place I'd never explored. A quiet wing with a faded wooden door labeled Special Collections. I hesitated, but she gave a small nod, and that was enough. Inside, the air was cooler. Still, it smelled of old paper and time. I wandered through tall shelves until I saw at the book, The Mirror in the Stacks, sitting on a pedestal as if it had been waiting for me. I picked it up again, but something was different. There were new pages, blank ones, and then handwritten in the same pen as the letter I'd found days earlier was a question scribbled across the top margin. What have you forgotten? I stared at the words, and suddenly the weight of it all came crashing in. Memories began rushing back, ones I'd buried under deadlines, expectations, and the pressure to keep moving forward. I remembered being a kid sneaking into the library in my neighborhood to escape the chaos of home. I remembered how books felt like portals, how I used to believe stories could heal things that medicine couldn't. And I remembered her, Miss Landry, the librarian who sat with me after school and taught me how to journal, how to ask questions, how to listen to silence. She used to leave books out for me just like this, books that somehow always answered what I couldn't say out loud. But when I was 13, we moved away. Suddenly, I never got to say goodbye. I didn't even realize how much I missed her, or how much I'd lost when I stopped believing that books could change anything. The initials on the letter L, M. Landry, Miss. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. The librarian here, the one who had handed me the book, who had watched me quietly all this time. She wasn't Miss Landry, but she knew her, maybe had worked with her, maybe had been given the task of finding me when the time was right. My hands trembled as I turned the page. Another question waited. What story are you still afraid to write? I broke down, right there in the quiet heart of the library, surrounded by old shelves and forgotten books. I let it all out, the grief, the anxiety, the shame of how far I'd drifted from the person I used to be. I'd convinced myself that dreams were impractical, that silence was a waste of time, that curiosity didn't pay the bills. But the truth was, I'd been starving for meaning, for connection, for someone, something to remind me that I still had a story worth telling. That book hadn't predicted my life. It had held it. It had waited for me to be ready. And when I finally closed the cover, I didn't feel like the same person who had walked into the library weeks ago, hunched over my phone, waiting for the world to distract me from my own emptiness. I felt awake, raw ready. When I walked out of that room, the librarian was waiting. She didn't say anything, just smiled. I smiled back, and for the first time in years, it felt real. I didn't leave the library with the book. That day I left with something much harder to carry, but far more valuable. A sense of clarity, a sense of self I hadn't touched in years. In the weeks that followed, my life didn't transform overnight. The clouds didn't part and golden light didn't suddenly pour onto a new, perfect path. But things began to shift subtly, steadily. I started walking more without earbuds in. I paid attention to conversations, to the curve of strangers' expressions, to the small stories happening around me every day, a journal again. Not for anyone else, not to post or perform, just to ask myself real questions and listen for honest answers. And I wrote, not for work, not for class. I wrote because I needed to remember who I was beneath all the noise. I wrote down dreams I had long shelved, scenes that had no plot yet, but made my heart beat a little faster. Little stories about people I'd seen in passing. I started treating my life like a living narrative, one I could shape, not control, but participate in with intention. I realized how numb I'd become from scrolling, comparing, racing to stay relevant. And I realized how powerful it is to pause. One afternoon I returned to the library, not searching for the book this time, but to thank her, the librarian. But she wasn't there. A younger man sat at the desk. When I asked about her, he blinked and said, "Oh, Miss Ellery. She retired last month, left pretty suddenly, said she had something important to finish." I stood there for a moment, unsure if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then he added, "She left a note, though. Said if someone came asking, I should give them this." He handed me a small square envelope. No name on the outside. Inside, a card. Simple handwriting. Keep turning the page. The story's still unfolding. It was signed only L. I still carry that card in my bag. Sometimes I reread it when I start to drift again, when the weight of expectations creeps in, or when I forget how much beauty there is in slowing down. I still visit the library often. I haven't seen the mirror in the stacks again. Maybe I never will. But that's okay, because I've realized the most powerful books don't just change your thoughts. They change the way you see your own story. And as for mine, I'm not trying to rush to the ending anymore. I'm just learning to stay with each chapter a little longer.